is well known these days that sport can have negative impacts on the environment. Around sport mega events and smaller events too, there can be impacts from the construction of facilities, food waste, and especially from event-related travel. Excessive chemical and water usage on golf courses can have negative consequences for wildlife and human health. Modifications to lakes and rivers for paddling activities can impact wetlands, and problems with soil erosion and natural vegetation are sometimes related to alpine skiing. Sport equipment production can also have negative consequences depending on the processes and materials used and what happens to these goods when owners are done with them.
Organizers of the Paris 2024 Olympics have an ambitious plan to become the first carbon-neutral games.
Fortunately, many sport industry members acknowledge these problems and recognize that without a plan to address environmental issues in their sports, they would not only be failing to respond to the existential crisis of climate change and related problems, but they would also be hurting the reputations of their organizations. Whatever the motivation is, in the world of sport, we see numerous well-publicized efforts to be more environmentally friendly, and especially, and these words matter, to be more sustainable. In fact, we see this word sustainability featured often in promotional efforts and reports by sport organizations, consultants, conference organizers, and others. And while the sport world's embrace of sustainability is in many ways something to celebrate, it raises questions too. What does it mean to be sustainable in and around sport? When an organization claims to be sustainable, does this necessarily mean they're being more environmentally friendly? What might be done to ensure that sustainable sport is also more environmentally friendly sport? Let's begin with a commonly referenced definition of sustainability that comes from a 1987 United Nations report, where sustainability, or more specifically sustainable development, was defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This definition emphasizes the inseparability of environmental, economic, and social issues, the three pillars of sustainability. The idea here is that forms of development can continue into the future if these three pillars are effectively balanced. It is perhaps unsurprising then that a sustainability approach is commonly favored by major sport organizations, government, businesses, and others that are simultaneously responsible for economic prosperity, progress on the environment, and social priorities. Think about the appeal here of sustainability as an approach that allows for the possibility that you can host a sport mega event like the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup, with all the travel and food waste and construction that's often associated with it, and still be sustainable if you can strike the right balance. And the logic of sustainability that explains how the triple bottom line works is compelling. By being environmentally friendly, such as reducing your impact through carbon offsetting and using green technologies, and by being socially responsible, holding events that help support communities through things like improved infrastructure, you will benefit economically because consumers who care about these things will attend your events and buy your products. So it's all good, right? Well, not necessarily. There are quite a few assumptions that go unquestioned when the sustainability story is told this way. One assumption is that economic growth and progress on environmental issues are compatible. You can hold sport mega events, continue many of the emissions associated with these events, and be sustainable. Another assumption is that we can rely on technology, innovation, and human ingenuity to solve environmental problems. That developing emissions-reducing technologies can and will enable us to enjoy sports with few environmental consequences and with few changes to our consumption practices. And as an economic bonus, these technologies can often be quite profitable and be useful across various industries and contexts. Another assumption is that by purchasing carbon offset credits, you can make up for or offset carbon emitted due to an activity or event. So even if new, greener technologies don't take care of emissions, carbon neutrality can still be achieved with enough offset purchases. But what happens when we look a little more closely at this optimistic story about sustainability and the assumptions that make it work? Although economic aims and environmental ones can certainly be compatible and often are, it's also known that as long as profit is the primary incentive for many organizations, then we should be unsurprised when the appearance of being green is sometimes prioritized over actually being green. When claims about addressing environmental concerns are not always matched by the kind of genuine pro-environment activity that's needed to address the climate crisis and other environmental problems. While technological advancements are vital in addressing environmental issues, it's important to recognize that relying exclusively on technological solutions has limitations. Humans are often too slow to find solutions to problems like these before irreversible damage is done, or too slow in addressing problems before new problems emerge, problems that require new solutions. Environmental scholar Thomas Homer Dixon has referred to this problem as the ingenuity gap. How about carbon offsetting? Let's begin by thinking about what a carbon offset purchase is. When you purchase an offset credit, you're contributing funds to an approved offset project that could be taking place anywhere in the world. This could be the building of a hydroelectric dam, or the development of wind farms, or in some cases, tree planting. If enough offset credits are purchased, almost any amount of emissions can be offset, as calculated by those certified to determine equivalency. We can see then how sport mega event organizers could always claim to have been carbon neutral if enough money was contributed to these projects. While recognizing that there are many effective and inspiring offset projects, it's also important to consider the problems with overstating the value of carbon offsetting in sport. One problem is that assessing the actual value of a carbon offset contribution is very difficult. For example, it's hard to know whether a successful project funded through carbon offset donations would have been completed even if many of those donations never took place. It can also be difficult to know, especially at the time when an offset contribution is being made, whether the donation went to a project that was successfully completed, or one that was never completed, or will never be completed. Critics also express justifiable concerns with the idea that certain kinds of environmental damage can be fixed with money. Is environmental damage in one part of the world really equivalent to an offset project in another part of the world? Is the ecosystem damage that may be associated with a carbon emission really equivalent to the carbon offset donation that's intended to make up for the emission? What I'm referring to here is an environmental equity issue, as humans are deciding what damage counts and what it means to make up for damage that has occurred to non-human systems and wildlife. Carbon offsetting certainly has its place and can offer great value. The idea here is that relying on carbon offsetting as a taken-for-granted answer to environmental problems and as a way of doing sustainable sport is more complicated than it seems, and is based on a set of assumptions that are not always mentioned. With this said, it would make sense to be open to a range of options for addressing sport-related environmental issues, including options outside of conventional ways of seeing sustainability. Let's begin with government agencies that fund elite sport. How about rewarding national sport organizations not only for athletic performance, but also for environmental performance, for using platforms to promote pro-environment behavior in and around sport, and for meeting incentives in day-to-day operations and team travel? This would be a new way of thinking about integrity in sport, of ethical sport. This would be sending a powerful and inspiring message about prioritizing the long-term health of the planet alongside athletic excellence. This would also be a different way of linking sport's benefits for society with economic and environmental outcomes. A different way of balancing the three pillars of sustainability, with environmental concerns getting the weighting they deserve. And for sport events, let's consider asking more pointed questions about sport's relationship with the environment that extend beyond the question of how can we hold the most sustainable sport events? How about also asking, when is a sport event too environmentally destructive to hold? Or, under what circumstances and in what context is truly environmentally friendly sport viable and not viable? If we don't ask these questions, then it's entirely possible that an event could be deemed sustainable if the economic benefits are thought to make up for the environmental shortfalls when balancing the triple bottom line. Asking, when is a sport event too environmentally impactful to hold? Acknowledges the limits of carbon offset programs as a way to pay off environmental damage. It acknowledges too that maybe the show doesn't have to go on if the environmental costs are too high. The final point concerns the need to think more expansively about sustainability itself. In research I conducted on the future of golf courses with Brad Millington of Brock University, we featured this question to invite thinking about how letting go of some of the things we value in the shorter term, like particularly impactful sport events or activities, might mean that the bigger things we value can be prioritized, like the long-term health of our planet and the lives of those most vulnerable during climate-related disasters. This more holistic view of sustainability is about prioritizing what matters the most and focusing on what is actually being sustained when we're unwilling to give up things that we're used to having, but could do without and perhaps should do without. Thinking more holistically also means asking questions about whose land sport events are held on and how they conceptualize and practice sustainability. It means creating the conditions for meaningful input from Indigenous peoples who practice balance and relational accountability with respect to the land and non-human worlds for thousands of years, and others who've also been historically excluded and devalued. It means thinking creatively and inclusively about what a more ethical and future-oriented version of sustainable sport might look like, and perhaps must look like, and how it can be attained.